So today's presentation is on inclusion pros and cons. The definition of mainstreaming. In the 70s and 80s, professionals called inclusion of students with special needs in the general education classroom mainstreaming. Mainstreaming refers to the inclusion of students with special needs in the general education process. Students are considered mainstreamed if they spend any part of the day with the general education peers. The definition of inclusion. The term used most today is called inclusion, not mainstreaming. In the article Inclusion on the Reading Rockets website, inclusion is defined as an effort to make sure students with disabilities go to school along with their friends and neighbors while also receiving whatever especially designed instruction and support they need to succeed as learners and to achieve high standards. There's many different special education legislation, and they are Education for All Handicapped Children Act, the No Child Left Behind Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, Americans with Disability Act, or the ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or Section 504. So the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. It was passed by Congress in 1975. This was the first special education law directed at students with physical and mental disabilities. The law stated that public schools must provide children with special needs with the same opportunities for education as other children. It is also required any public school that received federal funds to provide one free meal a day for these children. The mission of this act was to make special education services accessible to children who required them, maintain fair and appropriate services for disabled students, institute systematic evaluation requirements for special education, and endow federal resources to public schools for the education of disabled students. So this is a very important act for students with disabilities. In 2001, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is called No Child Left Behind, called for schools to be accountable for academic performance of all students with disabilities or not. It required schools in every state to develop routine assessments of students' academic skills. While it does not stipulate that these assessments meet a national standard, the law does oblige each state to come up with its own criteria for evaluation. No Child Left Behind provides incentives for schools to demonstrate progress in students with special needs. It also allows for students to seek alternative options if schools are not meeting their academic, social, or emotional needs. All right, the next one is the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504. Just the Rehabilitation Act. The Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, in programs receiving federal financial assistance, and in federal employment, and in the employment practices of federal contractors. These standards for determining employment discrimination under the Rehab Act are the same as those used in Title I of the Americans with Disability Act. And specifically, Section 504 states that no qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall be excluded from, denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance or is conducted by the executive agency of the United States Postal Service. These two are also very important acts for students with disabilities, especially Section 504. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. The IDEA was created in 1990, and it's a modification of the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act that we talked about previously. This law ensures that special needs students receive appropriate free public education in the least restrictive environment necessary to meet those students' needs. It helps students receive the extra assistance they need but allows them to participate in the same activities as children without special needs wherever possible. So although this law does not say inclusion, it talks about in the least restrictive environment necessary. And for a lot of students with disabilities, that is in the general education classroom with extra assistance. Okay, and the Americans with Disability Act, or the ADA, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. And it also applies to the U.S. Congress. Okay, so there are inclusion pros and cons. First, we talked about the special education legislation is for inclusion. We just talked about that, and it doesn't specifically say inclusion, but it says in the least restrictive environment with extra support. And not everyone is for inclusion. It could be the child's parents is not for inclusion. It could be the other parents in the class are not for inclusion. And some teachers, especially some general education teachers who may be afraid of how they're going to teach a student with a disability. They may be against inclusion. So inclusion pros. Students will be taught the same curriculum as their peers and have the same academic advantages offered to them, which they may not be given in a special education classroom. And students will be given the opportunity to socialize with a diverse group of peers, and this may improve their social skills. Some more pros: it fosters acceptance and understanding, which will translate outside the classroom. And the acceptance and understanding comes from the other students in the classroom that do not have disabilities. And then this one is also about those children. Children without disabilities may benefit from learning about differences between people and by having the opportunity to assist others. Teachers may benefit by achieving a broader appreciation of differences and by learning new techniques for instruction. Some cons. Special needs students may have a difficult time keeping up with the curriculum. This can cause your child to become frustrated and possibly disruptive in the class, which can slow the pace of the curriculum for the entire class. And just like any other classroom, there will still be misunderstandings and cases of bullying. And I think this one, especially in lower grades, we can talk to our kids in the general education classroom and let them know about that student. Why is that student, why maybe does that student have somebody helping them all the time? Just explain and introduce the student and what's going on, and kids are very understanding. So I feel like this con, especially in the lower grades, can really be taken care of because kids just are so understanding. This one says, danger, teacher in a bad mood. Another con is teachers' negative views on inclusion. That is a direct result of the lack of ability and confidence in being able to successfully teach students with disabilities. I think this can also be taken care of a lot with extra training for teachers. If we know that students with disabilities are going to be in their classrooms, then maybe we should provide, or maybe the school should provide some extra training for those teachers so they don't feel like they don't have the ability to teach these students. Here's some ideas on how to make inclusion work. First, provide adequate supports and services for the student. This may be in the general education classroom. Maybe the student has someone with them all the time, or maybe an inclusion teacher comes into the classroom during certain periods. It also can be accommodations in the classroom. Well-designed, individualized education programs. This is very important because every child is different and every child's going to need their education provided in a different way so that it is fair to them. And so this one's very important. Professional development for all teachers involved, general and special educators alike. That is extremely important. It gives the general education teacher the confidence to work with these students, and it gives the special educator, even sometimes they need more training. And time for teachers to plan, meet, create, evaluate the students together. This is very important that you have time to do this once, maybe even twice a week, because then you know that you're both on the same page. Reduce class size based on the severity of the student's needs. Professional skill development in the areas of cooperative learning, peer tutoring, adaptive curriculum, varied learning styles, etc. Collaboration between parents, teachers, and administrators, and sufficient funding so that schools will be able to develop programs for students based on student need instead of the availability of funding or lack thereof. The sufficient funding part may be a problem in some areas. Research on inclusion. On the negative side, as stated in Spotlight on Inclusion, what research and practice is telling the field, students have been found to perform worse academically in general education settings. Research has also suggested that students with disabilities experience social isolation in inclusive settings. Other research has illustrated that while physical inclusion may occur, very little integration or social inclusion may actually result for the student with a disability. On the positive side of research, the placement of the student in the general education classroom resulted in improved IEP quality, more student engagement, increased instructional time, and maintenance of individualized supports, according to the article Inclusion Education Research and Practice put out by the Maryland Coalition of Inclusion Education, which is the total opposite of what the other research said. Some more research, a 2-year study about inclusion of students with high incidence disabilities found that 41.7% of students with learning disabilities made progress in math in general education classrooms compared to 34% of special education students who were in self-contained classrooms. Also, gains in reading were comparable in both settings. And when comparing progress with their typical peers, 43.3% of students with disabilities made comparable or greater progress in math in an inclusive setting versus 35.9% in a self-contained classroom. When using class-wide tutors, significant increases in spelling, social studies, and academic indicators were observed. And in the National Longitudinal Transition Study of 11,000 students, it was found that more time spent in a general education classroom was positively correlated with fewer absences from school, fewer referrals for disruptive behavior, and they had better outcomes after high school in the areas of employment and individual living, which is a big goal for a lot of students with disabilities, to get a job and to live independently. Concerning students in the class who do not have disabilities, the following results were found. Inclusion does not compromise the general education students' outcomes. Typical peers benefit from involvement and relationships with students with disabilities in an inclusive setting, and the presence of students with disabilities in general education classrooms lead to new learning opportunities for typical students. So that's awesome. Not only is it great for a student with a disability and beneficial for that student to be in an inclusive setting, but it's also beneficial to the other students to have students with disabilities in their classroom. Inclusion and assessment. And based on my field experience, most students with disabilities are going to be required to take high-stakes tests. Making sure that schools meet 95% test participation mandated as required by the federal law under every Student Succeeds Act. And only some students may be medically exempt from these tests. It's very few though, because 95% of students have to take the tests, the high-stakes tests. I thought this was kind of funny. It's Darth Vader and it says, testing. I find your lack of tests disturbing. Because as everyone knows, we feel like there is so much testing going on in the classroom that we don't have time to actually teach what we think needs to be taught. We have to teach what's on the test. So accommodations must be made in the student's IEP to help the students, such as read alouds, they can mark in the test booklet, extended time, etc. And accommodations have to be made in the student's IEP within a certain period of time before the test to ensure that the student is going to be able to receive those accommodations on the high stakes tests. And the accommodations that you ask for during the high stakes test should be the same accommodations that your student uses in the classroom anyways. Cons to testing in an inclusive classroom. Unfortunately, it seems that inclusion efforts in testing often take priority over inclusion in the process of teaching material, which seems counterintuitive and places emphasis on numerical results rather than actual progress.